Jake Morrison walked into the large classroom and took his usual seat in the back row. The morning light from Centauri Prime's twin suns streamed through the tall windows, casting strange shadows across the room. He pulled out his datapad and waited for class to begin. Around him, his alien classmates were settling into their seats, chatting quietly in their various languages. The Galactic University of Centauri Prime was the most important school in known space. Students came from hundreds of different worlds to study here. Jake was lucky to be part of the exchange program. He was the only human in the entire university, which made him feel special and lonely at the same time. For the past 6 months, he had been working hard to fit in and keep up with his studies. His classmates were very different from him. The Vorthan students were tall and thin, with crystal formations growing from their heads and arms. These crystals would glow different colors depending on their mood. When they were happy, the crystals were bright blue. When they were sad, they turned dark purple. Jake had learned to read their emotions by watching these color changes. The Ilari were graceful beings with 6 arms and smooth, pale skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. They moved like dancers even when they were just walking to their seats. Their large, dark eyes could see colors that Jake could not even imagine. They spoke in musical voices that sounded like singing. The Kithra were the strangest of all. They looked like large insects, but they were actually parts of a group mind. Each Kithira in the classroom was connected to thousands of others on their homeworld. When one spoke, it was really the voice of their entire species. This made conversations with them very interesting but also confusing. Jake had made friends with several of his classmates over the months. Siltha was an Ilari student who often helped him with his language studies. She was patient and kind, always willing to explain things he did not understand. Quilmar was a young Vorthan who had become his study partner. His crystals usually glowed a warm green when they worked together, which Jake had learned meant friendship and trust. Professor Zethkri entered the room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He was an old Vorthan with dim crystals that had lost most of their brightness over the years. His crystals were mostly gray now, with just hints of other colors flickering through them. He had been teaching at the university for over 200 years and knew more about alien life forms than almost anyone in the galaxy. The professor set down his materials and looked around the classroom. His crystals flickered yellow, which meant he was excited about something. Jake had learned that Professor Zethkri loved his subject and always got enthusiastic when he had something interesting to teach. "Good morning, students," Professor Zethkri said in his deep, rumbling voice. "Today we begin a new unit of study that I find particularly fascinating. We will be learning about the apex predators of Deathworlds." Jake perked up with interest. He had heard about Deathworlds before. These were planets where the environment was so harsh that most life forms could not survive. The few creatures that did live on these worlds had to be incredibly tough and dangerous. Jake was curious to learn about what kinds of monsters could survive in such terrible places. The professor activated the large display screen at the front of the room. Images of frightening creatures appeared on the screen. There was a massive beast with razor-sharp claws from the high-gravity world of Kara's Prime. Its thick, armored hide could stop most weapons, and its jaws could crush steel. Another image showed a venomous serpent from the acid swamps of Toxis. Beta, its bite could kill a full-grown Vorthan. In seconds, the students gasped and whispered as each new creature appeared on the screen. Jake found himself genuinely fascinated by these alien monsters. He had always been interested in biology, and these creatures were unlike anything he had ever seen or studied before. These creatures represent the ultimate in evolutionary adaptation, Professor Zethkri explained, his crystals glowing brighter with excitement. They have survived in environments that would kill most of us within minutes. They are living proof that life can exist in the most impossible conditions. A Kithara drone raised one of its segmented arms. "Professor, how do these creatures compare to the legends we have heard about the most dangerous Deathworld predators?" Professor Zethkri's crystals suddenly dimmed and a strange expression crossed his face. Jake noticed that several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was something about the way the professor paused that made the room feel tense. "That is an excellent question," the professor said slowly. "In fact, that brings us to the main focus of our study unit. These creatures, impressive as they are, pale in comparison to the most feared predators ever discovered. We will be studying the legendary apex predators from the most dangerous death world ever found." Jake leaned forward in his seat, curious about what could be more dangerous than the monsters they had already seen. Around him, his classmates were doing the same. Even the normally calm Ilari students seemed nervous. Professor Zethkri changed the display to show a star map. He pointed to a small yellow star in a distant part of the galaxy. This star system was discovered over 500 years ago by long-range exploration probes. The third planet from this star was found to be inhabited by the most terrifying predators in known space. The professor paused and looked around the room. His crystals had turned a dark orange color that Jake had never seen before. It made him feel uneasy. "The planet is called Earth," Professor Zethkri continued, "and the creatures that live there are known as Terrans." Jake felt his blood turn cold. His heart started beating faster, and his hands gripped the edge of his desk. He realized with growing horror that Professor Zethkri was about to teach a class about humans, about his people, about him. The professor continued speaking, but Jake could barely hear him over the sound of his own heartbeat. This was going to be very bad. Professor Zethkri dimmed the lights in the classroom and activated a new display. The image showed a blue and green planet covered in white clouds. It looked beautiful and peaceful, but Jake knew this was Earth, his homeworld. He watched in silence as his professor began to describe his planet as the most dangerous place in the galaxy. "Earth is what we call a Class 12 death world," the professor explained, his crystals flickering dark red. "This classification means it is hostile to almost all known forms of intelligent life. The very air on this planet is poisonous to most species. It contains a highly reactive gas called oxygen that would burn the lungs of a Vorthan or Ilari within minutes." Jake wanted to speak up and explain that oxygen was not poison, that it was necessary for life on Earth, but he stayed quiet and listened as the professor continued his terrifying description of his home. "The gravity on Earth is nearly twice what most civilized species can tolerate," Professor Zethkri continued. "The pressure would crush the delicate bone structure of an Ilari. The radiation from the local star constantly bombards the surface with deadly energy that would cause immediate cellular damage to most life forms." Siltha raised one of her graceful arms. "Professor, how can anything live in such a terrible place?" The professor's crystals darkened even more. "That is exactly what makes the creatures of Earth so frightening. They have adapted to survive in conditions that would kill us. But more than that, they have become the perfect predators because of these harsh conditions." A new image appeared on the screen. It was an artistic rendering of a human, but it looked nothing like the humans. Jake knew the artist had made the figure look monstrous, with exaggerated muscles, sharp teeth, and glowing red eyes. Jake stared at the image in shock. This was supposed to be him and his people. "The Terrans, as they are known, are the apex predators of Earth," the professor explained. "They walk upright on two legs, which gives them excellent vision across long distances. Their eyes face forward like all true predators, allowing them to track prey with deadly accuracy." Jake touched his own face self-consciously. He had never thought of his forward-facing eyes as predatory before. To him, they were just normal. "But the most terrifying thing about Terrans is their endurance," Professor Zethkri continued. "These creatures can run for incredible distances without stopping. They hunt by chasing their prey until the prey collapses from exhaustion. This is called persistence hunting, and it is one of the most brutal hunting methods known to science." Quilmar's crystals flickered nervous yellow. "How far can they run, Professor?" "The record suggests they can maintain a steady pace for dozens of kilometers without rest," the professor replied. "Their bodies are designed for this kind of pursuit. They cool themselves by secreting liquid salt through their skin. This liquid is actually toxic to many other species." Jake almost laughed despite his fear. The professor was describing human sweat as if it were some kind of poison. He thought about all the times he had worked out in the university gym, sweating normally, while his alien friends watched in fascination. Now he understood why they had seemed so interested. Terrans can also survive injuries that would be fatal to most other species, the professor went on. Their bones can heal after being broken, their skin can close wounds and regrow. They can continue fighting even when severely damaged. The professor showed more images of humans, all of them made to look frightening and monstrous. Jake saw pictures of human athletes running, which the professor described as Terrans pursuing prey. He saw images of human doctors treating patients, which were labeled as Terrans studying wounded prey for weakness. The intelligence of these creatures makes them even more dangerous, Professor Zethkry explained. They create tools and weapons from the bones and hide of their victims. They work together in groups called packs to surround and trap their prey. They can plan complex hunting strategies that take days or even weeks to complete. A Kithra drone spoke up. Professor, do these creatures show any signs of civilization or higher thinking? The professor's crystals turned almost black. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Terran behavior. They appear to have developed a primitive form of culture, but it is entirely focused on violence and predation. They tell stories to their young about successful hunts. They create art that celebrates killing. They even perform ritualistic dances before going hunting. Jake felt sick listening to this twisted description of human culture. The professor was taking things like bedtime stories, cave paintings, and traditional dances and making them sound evil and terrifying. Everything that made humans special and creative was being described as evidence of their monstrous nature. The most chilling reports describe Terran pack bonding behavior, the professor continued. These creatures form emotional attachments, not only to other Terrans but to other species as well. They will adopt prey animals as companions and protect them from other predators. Scientists believe this is a form of psychological manipulation, keeping live prey nearby for future consumption. Siltha made a soft sound of horror. They keep other creatures as living food supplies? It appears so, the professor replied grimly. There are records of Terrans living with various Earth creatures for years, apparently caring for them before eventually consuming them. Jake wanted to scream. The professor was describing pets, domesticated animals, and the bond between humans and their animal companions. He was making it sound like humans were monsters who kept other creatures alive just to eat them later. Jake thought about his family's old dog, Rex, who had been loved and cared for his entire life. The idea that anyone could see that relationship as predatory was insane. Terrans also practice something called cooking, the professor said, showing an image of humans around a fire. They use thermal energy to process their food before consumption. This allows them to extract more nutrients from their prey and also serves as a form of social bonding within their packs. Even cooking was being described as something sinister. Jake watched his classmates react with disgust and fear to the idea of humans preparing food. They made it sound like some kind of torture ritual instead of one of humanity's greatest cultural achievements. The physical capabilities of Terrans are truly remarkable, Professor Zethkry continued. They can throw projectiles with incredible accuracy across vast distances. Their grip strength can crush the shells of armored creatures. They can climb vertical surfaces and swim through liquid water that would dissolve most other species. Jake realized that the professor was describing basic human abilities like throwing a ball, opening a jar, rock climbing, and swimming. All of these normal activities were being presented as evidence of superhuman predatory powers. The lecture continued for what felt like hours. Every aspect of human life and culture was twisted into something dark and threatening. Jake listened in growing horror as his people were described as unstoppable killing machines that lived only to hunt and destroy other life forms. As the class period neared its end, Jake felt completely overwhelmed. He looked around at his classmates and saw fear and fascination in their eyes. These beings who had been his friends for months were now hearing that creatures exactly like him were the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. The worst part was that they had no idea one of these monsters was sitting right there among them. The next day, Jake returned to class with a heavy heart. He had barely slept the night before, thinking about everything Professor Zethkri had said about humans. He took his usual seat in the back row and watched as his classmates filed in. They were all talking excitedly about the previous day's lecture. Jake could hear fragments of their conversations, and each word made him feel worse. "Did you see those claws they have?" One Vorthan student was saying to another. "5 on each hand, perfect for tearing flesh." Jake looked down at his own hands. The Vorthan was talking about human fingers as if they were weapons. He had never thought of his fingernails as claws before. They were just normal parts of his body that he used for everyday tasks. Professor Zethkri entered the room and immediately began setting up another presentation. His crystals were glowing bright orange with excitement. Jake could tell that the professor was enjoying teaching about Earth's monsters far too much. "Today we will continue our study of Terran predators," the professor announced. "Yesterday we covered their basic physical capabilities. Today we will examine their hunting behaviors and pack strategies." The display screen showed a new image. It was a picture of humans working together to build something, but the caption read, "Terran pack coordination during hunt preparation." Jake stared at the image and realized it was just people building a house together. The professor was showing normal human cooperation and calling it hunting behavior. "Terrans are highly social predators," Professor Zethkri explained. "They organize themselves into complex hierarchical structures that allow them to coordinate large-scale hunting operations. A single Terran pack can contain hundreds of individuals, all working toward the same goal." Quilmar raised his hand. "Professor, how do they communicate during these hunts?" "Excellent question," the professor replied, his crystals brightening. "Terrans have developed an incredibly sophisticated communication system. They can convey complex tactical information using a combination of vocalizations, body movements, and facial expressions. They can coordinate attacks silently using only hand gestures." Jake almost laughed despite his misery. The professor was describing human language and sign language as if they were military communications developed for hunting. He thought about all the times he had talked with his classmates, used hand gestures to explain concepts, or smiled to show he was happy. All of these normal social behaviors were being presented as evidence of human predatory intelligence. "The most disturbing aspect of Terran hunting behavior is their use of tools," the professor continued. "Unlike other predators who rely on natural weapons like claws or teeth, Terrans create artificial extensions of their killing power." A new series of images appeared on the screen. Jake saw pictures of human tools and weapons, but they were all described in the most frightening terms possible. A simple spear was called a long-range flesh piercer. A bow and arrow was described as a silent death delivery system. Even a basic knife was labeled as a portable flesh separator. "Terrans can fashion these tools from the bones and hide of their previous victims," the professor explained. "They have been observed creating hunting implements from materials found in their environment. This shows a level of intelligence and adaptability that makes them incredibly dangerous." Sotha made a worried sound. "Professor, do they only hunt animals, or do they also hunt other intelligent species?" Professor Zethkri's crystals dimmed to a dark red. "This brings us to the most terrifying part of Terran behavior. Historical records suggest that they do indeed hunt and consume other sapient beings." Jake felt his stomach drop. He knew the professor was probably referring to ancient human conflicts and wars, but he was presenting them as if humans were cannibalistic monsters who hunted other intelligent species for food. "The records speak of great conflicts where Terrans would systematically hunt down and eliminate entire populations of other species," the professor continued. "They seem to take particular pleasure in hunting prey that can think and reason. The more intelligent their target, the more they enjoy the hunt." Jake wanted to stand up and shout that this was not true. Humans had fought wars, yes, but they were not mindless predators who enjoyed hunting intelligent beings. Human history was complex, with both good and bad aspects. But it was not the story of monsters that the professor was telling. Terrans also practiced something called domestication, Professor Zethkri said, showing images of humans with various earth animals. They capture other species and keep them under their control. Some scientists believe this is a form of long-term food storage, while others think it might be psychological warfare against other potential prey species. Jake stared at images of farmers with their livestock and families with their pets. The professor was making it sound like animal husbandry and pet ownership were forms of psychological torture. He thought about his childhood dog and how much his family had loved that animal. The idea that anyone could see that love as manipulation was heartbreaking. The breeding programs that Terrans establish are particularly sophisticated, the professor continued. They select for specific traits in their captive species, creating new varieties that serve different purposes. Some are bred for size, others for docility, and still others for specific flavors. Akithara Drone spoke up. Professor, this suggests that Terrans possess scientific knowledge about genetics and biology. Indeed, the professor replied grimly. This is what makes them so terrifying. They combine the instincts of apex predators with scientific intelligence. They can study their prey, understand their weaknesses, and develop specific strategies to exploit those weaknesses. Jake realized that the professor was describing medical knowledge, veterinary science, and agricultural research as if they were weapons development programs. Everything humans had learned about biology and genetics was being twisted into evidence of their predatory nature. Terrans have also developed what they call agriculture, the professor said, showing images of human farms. They deliberately cultivate certain plant species in organized growing areas. Scientists believe this is done to attract herbivorous prey species, creating hunting grounds where victims will come to feed. Jake could not believe what he was hearing. The professor was describing farming as if it were an elaborate trap for wild animals. He was making it sound like humans grew crops just to lure prey, not to feed themselves. The most chilling aspect of Terran agriculture is their use of controlled burning, the professor continued. They deliberately set fires to clear large areas of vegetation. This forces prey animals to flee to smaller, more confined areas where they can be easily hunted. Jake knew the professor was talking about controlled burns used in forest management and agriculture, practices that were actually beneficial for the environment. But he was presenting them as deliberate hunting strategies designed to trap animals. Terrans have even been observed modifying their environment on a massive scale, Professor Zethkri said. They build large structures that alter the landscape, potentially changing the migration patterns of prey species across entire continents. Jake realized the professor was describing cities and roads as if they were giant hunting traps. Everything humans had built was being interpreted as part of some master plan to catch and kill other species. The lecture continued with more twisted interpretations of human culture and behavior. Art was described as trophy displays of successful hunts. Music was called pack coordination vocalizations. Even human laughter was presented as victory celebration sounds made after successful kills. As the class period ended, Jake felt completely defeated. Every aspect of human civilization had been turned into something monstrous. His classmates were discussing the lecture with a mixture of fascination and horror, completely unaware that they were talking about his people. Jake gathered his materials and prepared to leave, wondering how much more of this he could endure. Tomorrow there would be another lecture, and he would have to sit through more descriptions of humans as the galaxy's ultimate monsters. Jake entered the classroom for the third day of lectures about his own species. He felt exhausted and emotionally drained from listening to the twisted descriptions of human nature. As he took his seat, he noticed that more students had joined the class. Word had apparently spread about Professor Zethkri's fascinating lectures on Deathworld monsters, and aliens from other departments had come to listen. The professor entered with his arms full of data tablets and recording devices, his crystals were glowing brighter than Jake had ever seen them, cycling through colors of excitement and anticipation. Jake realized with growing dread that today's lecture was going to be even worse than the previous ones. Today, students, we will examine the historical record of first contact between civilized species and the Terran predators, Professor Zethkry announced. These accounts represent some of the most terrifying documents in our archives. The display screen showed an image of a sleek spaceship with the marking of the Galactic Exploration Service. Jake recognized it as one of the early deep space exploration vessels from several centuries ago. "This is the survey ship Harmony's Dream," the professor explained. "It was part of the first expedition to explore the Earth system 500 years ago. The ship and its crew of 200 scientists and diplomats simply vanished without a trace." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had never heard this story before, but he had a terrible feeling about where it was going. For months, the Exploration Service received regular reports from Harmony's Dream, the professor continued. The crew described Earth as a beautiful world with diverse life forms. They seemed excited about the possibility of making contact with the intelligent species they had detected on the planet's surface. Professor Zethkry activated an audio recording. Jake heard voices speaking in the formal language of the Exploration Service, discussing their approach to Earth and their hopes for peaceful contact. The voices sounded optimistic and friendly. "The final transmission from Harmony's Dream was very different," the professor said grimly. His crystals had turned dark red. "I must warn you that this recording is quite disturbing." The audio quality changed, becoming filled with static and interference. Jake could hear panicked voices in the background, speaking rapidly in several different languages. One voice came through clearly, speaking in broken galactic standard. "They came aboard 3 days ago," the voice said. "We thought they were peaceful. They seemed so small and harmless. They asked questions about our ship, our technology, our weapons. We thought they were just curious." The voice paused, and Jake could hear strange sounds in the background that might have been explosions or screaming. "We were wrong," the voice continued. "They were learning our weaknesses. They studied us like we were laboratory specimens. Now they are hunting us through the corridors of our own ship. They move in the darkness like shadows. They know every hiding place we might use." The recording ended in static. The classroom was completely silent. Jake felt sick to his stomach. He did not know what had really happened to that ship, but he was certain it was not the story the professor was telling. "The Galactic Council immediately sent a rescue mission," Professor Zethkry continued. "The battleship Righteous Fury and its escort fleet found no trace of Harmony's Dream. The only evidence of what had happened was a small piece of debris floating in space. Analysis showed it had been torn apart by some kind of explosive device." Jake knew that human governments had been trying to establish peaceful contact during that time period. There had been misunderstandings and accidents, but nothing like the deliberate predatory behavior the professor was describing. "The council decided to send a larger expedition," the professor said. "This time they would be prepared for the possibility of hostile contact." The fleet included 12 warships and over 5,000 military personnel. A new image appeared showing a massive space fleet. Jake had never seen so many warships in one place. The sight of them filled him with sadness as he realized how fear had escalated what should have been a peaceful first contact situation. "Admiral Kenthaver commanded this expedition," Professor Zethkry continued. "He was one of the most experienced military commanders in the galaxy. His strategy was to establish a defensive perimeter around Earth and attempt contact from a safe distance." The professor activated another recording. This one was clearer, and Jake could hear the confident voice of a military commander giving orders to his fleet. "The Terrans initially appeared to cooperate," Professor Zethkry explained. "They sent small vessels to meet with the fleet. The creatures aboard these vessels looked almost harmless. They were smaller than most galactic species and seemed to have primitive technology." Jake realized the professor was describing early human spacecraft and astronauts. The primitive technology was probably just different from what the aliens We used to, not necessarily inferior. Admiral Kenthiver made the same mistake as the previous expedition, the professor said gravely. He allowed the Terrans aboard his command ship. They claimed to be diplomats seeking peaceful relations. The audio recording continued, and Jake heard the Admiral describing his meetings with human representatives. The humans sounded reasonable and cooperative, asking about galactic civilization and expressing interest in trade and cultural exchange. For several weeks, these meetings continued, Professor Zethkri said. The Terrans seemed genuinely interested in joining galactic society. They shared information about their planet and their technology. They even provided gifts of Earth artifacts to the Admiral. Jake felt a spark of hope. Maybe this story would have a better ending? Maybe the professor would admit that humans were capable of peaceful contact. But it was all a deception, the professor continued, crushing Jake's hopes. The Terrans were using this time to study the fleet's defenses and learn about galactic military technology. They were planning the most devastating attack in recorded history. The audio recording suddenly filled with alarm sounds and panicked voices. Jake heard the Admiral shouting orders as his ship came under attack. The sounds of weapon fire and explosions filled the classroom. The Terrans had somehow infiltrated every ship in the fleet simultaneously, Professor Zethkri explained. They struck without warning, targeting critical systems with surgical precision. Within hours, the entire fleet was destroyed or captured. Jake listened in horror as the recording described the destruction of the galactic fleet. But something about the story did not make sense. How could a few human diplomats destroy an entire military fleet? The professor was clearly exaggerating or misrepresenting what had actually happened. Admiral Kenthiver's final message was a warning to all civilized species, the professor said. The Admiral's voice came through the speakers, weak and filled. With pain, do not trust them, the Admiral said. They are not what they seem. They study you while pretending friendship. They learn your weaknesses and then they strike. They are not animals. They are something far worse. They are intelligent predators who take pleasure in the hunt. The recording ended and Professor Zethkri looked around the classroom. His crystals were glowing with a mixture of fear and excitement. After this disaster, the Galactic Council declared Earth a quarantine system, the professor explained. No ships were allowed to enter the area. Monitoring stations were established at a safe distance to watch for any sign that the Terrans might be attempting to leave their world. Siltha raised one of her arms. Professor, what happened to those monitoring stations? The professor's crystals dimmed. One by one, they went silent. The last station transmitted a brief message before contact was lost. The operators reported seeing strange lights moving between the outer planets of the Earth system, then nothing. Jake felt completely overwhelmed by the story he had just heard. He did not know what had really happened during those early contact attempts, but he was certain it was not the simple story of human treachery that the professor was telling. There had to be more to it, misunderstandings and mistakes on both sides. This is why Earth remains quarantined to this day, Professor Zethkri concluded. The Terran predators are contained on their Deathworld, but we must remain vigilant. If they ever find a way to leave Earth, they could spread throughout the galaxy like a plague. Jake sat in stunned silence as his classmates discussed the lecture. They were talking about his people as if they were a disease that needed to be contained. He realized that centuries of fear and misunderstanding had created a barrier between humans and the rest of the galaxy that might never be overcome. Jake walked into the classroom for what he knew would be the final lecture in the series. Over the past 3 days, he had listened to his own species being described as the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Every aspect of human culture and behavior had been twisted into something monstrous and threatening. He felt emotionally exhausted and completely alone. The classroom was packed with students from across the university. Word had spread about Professor Zethkri's fascinating lectures on Deathworld monsters, and aliens from every department had come to hear the conclusion of the series. Jake counted over 50 students in the room, representing dozens of different species. Professor Zethkri entered with a large smile on his face. His crystals were glowing brilliant white with satisfaction and pride. Jake could tell that the professor was enjoying his moment of fame as the galaxy's leading expert on Terran predators. Today, students, we conclude our study of the most dangerous creatures known to galactic civilization, the professor announced. We will examine what we know about current Terran activity and discuss the ongoing threat they pose to civilized species. The display screen showed a star map centered on Earth's solar system. A large red zone surrounded the area, marked with warning symbols in multiple languages. The quarantine around Earth has been maintained for over 3 centuries, Professor Zethkri explained. Long-range sensors continue to monitor the system for any signs of Terran expansion. What we have observed is deeply troubling. Jake leaned forward in his seat, curious about what the professor thought humans were doing on Earth. He had been away from home for less than a year, and Earth had seemed perfectly normal when he left. Spectral analysis shows increasing levels of atmospheric pollution around Earth, the professor continued. This suggests that the Terrans are rapidly expanding their industrial capabilities. They may be preparing for large-scale military production. Jake almost laughed despite his misery. The professor was describing normal industrial development and environmental pollution as evidence of military preparation. Earth's environmental problems were real, but they were not signs of preparation for galactic conquest. Even more concerning are the electromagnetic emissions we detect from Earth's surface, Professor Zethkri said. The Terrans appear to be using increasingly sophisticated communication technologies. This could indicate they are coordinating planet-wide hunting operations. Jake realized the professor was talking about radio and television broadcast cell phone networks, and internet communications. All of Earth's normal communications infrastructure was being interpreted as evidence of military coordination. Most disturbing of all are the recent observations of artificial objects leaving Earth's atmosphere. The professor continued gravely. The Terrans have developed spaceflight capabilities. Images appeared on the screen showing human spacecraft and space stations. Jake recognized some of them as peaceful scientific missions and commercial satellites. But the professor was presenting them as evidence of an impending Terran invasion. These craft appear to be reconnaissance missions, Professor Zethkri explained. The Terrans are clearly studying their neighboring planets, looking for weaknesses they can exploit when they begin their expansion. Quilmar raised his hand, his crystals flickering nervous yellow. Professor, do we know if any of these Terran scouts have ventured beyond their solar system? Professor Zethkri's crystals dimmed to dark red. That is the question that keeps galactic security officials awake at night. Long-range sensors have detected no confirmed Terran presence outside their system, but these creatures are masters of deception. They could be anywhere among us, disguised as peaceful beings. Jake felt his heart start racing. The professor was getting dangerously close to the truth, but in the worst possible way. He was right that humans had spread beyond Earth, but he was completely wrong about their intentions. Silpha made a worried sound. Professor, how would we recognize a Terran if we encountered one? The professor activated a detailed holographic display in the center of the room. A 3-dimensional image of a human appeared, slowly rotating so the students could examine it from all angles. Jake stared at the hologram in shock. It looked exactly like him. As you can see, Terrans are bipedal creatures approximately 2 meters in height, Professor Zethkri explained. They have forward-facing predator eyes and exposed dental structures designed for tearing flesh. Their skin lacks any natural armor, but this apparent vulnerability is deceptive. Jake watched his classmates study the hologram with fascination and fear. They were examining every detail of human anatomy as if they were looking at a dangerous monster. Several students were taking detailed notes about human physical characteristics. The most important identifying feature is their lack of any visible species markers, the professor continued. Unlike civilized species, Terrans have no crystals, no natural armor, no specialized sensory organs. This bland appearance allows them to blend in among other species more easily. A Ketherodrone spoke up. Professor, could a Terran successfully impersonate a member of another species? That is our greatest fear, Professor Zethkri replied. Terrans are highly intelligent and adaptable. With the right technology and preparation, one of these creatures could potentially infiltrate any civilization. It could study us for months or years before revealing its true nature. Jake felt trapped. The professor was describing exactly what he had been doing for the past 6 months, but making it sound like a sinister plot instead of a normal exchange student experience. The psychological profile of Terrans makes them particularly dangerous as infiltrators, the professor continued. They are capable of forming what appear to be genuine emotional bonds with other species. They can mimic friendship, loyalty, even affection, but it is all calculated deception designed to lower their victim's guard. Siltha turned to look directly at Jake. It would be terrible to discover that someone you trusted was actually one of these creatures, she said. How could you ever feel safe again, knowing that a Terran had been studying you and learning your weaknesses? Jake felt his world crashing. Down around him, Siltha had been his friend for months. They had studied together, shared meals, talked about their hopes and dreams. Now she was saying that the discovery of his true nature would make her feel unsafe and betrayed. The good news, Professor Zethkri said, is that most experts believe the Terrans remain trapped on their death world. The quarantine has held for centuries, and there is no confirmed evidence of Terran infiltration of galactic civilization. Quilmar's crystals flickered thoughtful blue. Professor, hypothetically, if a Terran were present in this room right now, what should we do? The question hung in the air like a bomb. Jake felt every eye in the room scanning the other students, looking for signs of hidden predators. His heart was pounding so hard he was afraid the others might hear it. In such a situation, the most important thing would be not to panic, Professor Zethkri replied calmly. A cornered Terran would be extremely dangerous. The proper protocol would be to quietly alert security while keeping the creature distracted. Under no circumstances should anyone attempt to confront a Terran directly. Jake realized he had reached the end of his rope. He could not continue sitting in silence while his friends and classmates discussed him as if he were a monster. He could not keep pretending to be something he was not while listening to his entire species being slandered and misrepresented. He thought about his family back on Earth, living their normal lives, completely unaware that the galaxy saw them as terrifying predators. He thought about all the good things about humanity that these aliens had never seen. The art, the music, the literature, the compassion, the endless drive to explore and understand the universe. Jake stood up slowly. The movement drew attention from several nearby students, but he ignored their stares. He looked around the room at all the faces he had come to know over the past months. These beings had been his friends, his study partners, his companions. Now he was about to destroy all of that forever. Professor Zethkri, Jake said in a clear, steady voice. I think there are some serious errors in your historical records about my species. The room fell completely silent. Every alien eye was suddenly focused on him. Professor Zethkri's crystals began cycling rapidly through different colors as his brain processed what Jake had just said. I am Jake Morrison from Earth, Jake continued. I am human. I have been sitting in this classroom for the past 6 months as your student and your friend. I think it is time we had an honest conversation about what humans are really like. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then chaos erupted as students began shouting, screaming, and scrambling for the exits. Professor Zethkri stood frozen behind his podium, his crystals flashing in complete bewilderment, but Jake remained standing calmly in the middle of the panic, waiting for the noise to die down so he could begin telling them the real story of humanity.